Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Rob Farley. I'm assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. And with me today is the author of Hanoi's War. We've mentioned this book before, and this scholar before, Lien-Hang Nguyen. And we are happy to have her, actually, from the very same building that I'm recording from, just from different offices. How are you today, Hang?
I'm good. How are you, Rob?
I am sick, actually. We've had horrible weather in Kentucky. And so just after during a week of having my children at home, because everything's been horrible, I get sick. So, I guess that's the breaks. Um, can you introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Kentucky. I've been here 8 years, just published Hanoi's War in 2012, and currently working on a second book project also on the Vietnam War.
Cool. Oh, maybe we can ask you a little bit about the second book project at the very end, if you want.
Sure.
So I mentioned earlier, and this was during, I can't remember, something about the Iranian negotiations, but I mentioned your book in passing, and so we had a few requests actually from our viewers that we have you on. And so I guess rather than have me try to summarize it, why don't you basically summarize, I guess, the argument and the contribution of Hanoi's War?
Sure. Hanoi's War, the full title is Hanoi's War in International History, the War for Peace in Vietnam, is essentially almost two books in one. The first part of the book, the first half of the book, talks about Hanoi's road to war, in particular, the decision making taking place in the Vietnam Workers' Politburo. That's the Vietnam Workers' Party, VWP Politburo, and the decisions that they made from the end of the French Indochina War in 1954 to when they decided to go for all-out war in 1963 and to the Tet Offensive in 1968. And I talk about the personalities involved, the state of what I call the police state in Hanoi, and how North Vietnamese leaders were able to mobilize its people to go to war against the Republic of Vietnam or the Saigon regime, as well as the United States. The second half of the book talks about the period of peace negotiations from 1969 to 1973, and that's why I call that part the war for peace. But really, no party was really interested in compromise.
Right.
Instead, they wanted to win the war militarily on the ground so that it would affect negotiations at Paris in terms of a favorable settlement.
Right. So, what's interesting about this is that it concentrates primarily just on. I mean, it's overwhelming. It's not entirely on North Vietnamese decision making, but it's overwhelmingly on North Vietnamese decision making, right? Rather than trying to sort of interpret North Vietnam's preferences through an American lens or even a Chinese lens, but it concentrates on sort of the internal politics of North Vietnam, both at primarily at an elite level, but also, as you mentioned, at a popular level too, right? I
Yes.
liked how you discussed on several occasions, as you suggested, how the DRV was able to mobilize support and suppress dissent in order
Yes.
to sort of create a more formidable fighting capacity.
Yes, it's true. And I think right now there are about 30,000 books on the Vietnam War, and the majority focus on the United States war experience. And I call this an international history because even though the focus is on Hanoi's perspective, it was very much, international factors had a major influence on the way that North Vietnamese leaders waged their war. In terms of decision making from the very start, in terms of when they wanted to upgrade to a military conflict, that was very much affected by the Sino-Soviet split.
Right.
So international factors even affected the situation in the first half of the book, which focuses more on sort of what you would think of as sort of internal decision making in North Vietnam and Hanoi. And the second half, which is about the peace negotiations, China and the Soviet Union again play a very big factor in the way the peace negotiations proceeded from 69 to 73. So it is an international history, just that it's from the perspective of Hanoi and not Washington, D.C. So in that sense, it's one of these newer wave of books coming out on the Vietnam War that kind of decenter the United States.
Right. I mean, if you could, and I don't know if you want to quite boil it down in these terms, right? But and I hate I hate the phrase myth busting, right? But if you were to take away,
Yeah.
I mean, I had known you were writing it, but then I remembered, and I was sort of reintroduced to the book by the review that was done at Tom Rick's blog a while back, and I can't remember who wrote it. It wasn't Tom Rick's, but if you were to say, what are the most common myths about not only North Vietnamese decision making, but also North Vietnam's relationship with the Soviet Union and
Yeah.
China. Sort of the most
Yeah.
common American myths that,
Yeah.
I don't want to say the book dispels, but that the book sort of makes us look differently at.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I counted, I was forced to count it at one point, and I think I challenge seven myths in
Hmm.
particular about our or conventional understanding of the Vietnam War, and the review in Best Defense and the Rick's blog was great. And I also wrote about these myths in a New York Times op-ed that was printed in mid-August. But the seven, I think, according to my count, include the the first, which is the common understanding was that North Vietnam went to war in the South to save the Southern insurgency from Nguyen Diem's troops in late 1959. According to my research, I found that there were domestic factors that had a part in why Hanoi went to war in the late 1950s, in the sense that they were also going through a lot of problems in terms of state building. There was a chaotic land reform campaign that really alienated the people, and in fact, the military in the North had to fire upon its people because there were so many uprisings against the land reform and party organizational rectification campaign in the mid 1950s. So after the French Indochina War, following on the heels of that, there was major literati, intelligentsia dissidence campaign. Also around the time, and then of course their state building projects weren't producing the results that the party had wanted, and so I think it was a very strategic decision to go to war in the South to whip up support for the party. So that was sort of the first myth that I either debunked or challenged, depending on if you agree or buy my argument. The second is this idea that Hanoi. The party leadership in Hanoi had always been a sort of collective decision-making body under the benevolent guidance of Ho Chi Minh until his passing in 1969. Unlike the Chinese and the Soviets, there weren't any purges that the North Vietnamese leaders, the Vietnamese communist leaders, got along. And I showed in the book that in fact that wasn't the case, and the person whose name should be synonymous with the Vietnam War or even the Cold War is a man by the name of Lê Duẩn or Lê Duẩn. And he constructed what I called a police state by co-opting apparatchik deputies in Hanoi.
Right, and the war, and I think one of the most interesting parts of the book is how much the war plays a role in intra-party conflict, right, and how Lê uses the war. I mean, which is not to say he's not committed. He's obviously committed to the war in the South, and that's one of his most important projects. But he uses the war as a way of winning intra-elite conflicts.
Yes, and that's connected to the third point, the third myth, which is that the Vietnamese communist struggle was a sort of unified, harmonious struggle that were able to unify the North and the South, Southern Vietnamese people to fight against a common cause, the United States and its lackey government or regime in Saigon. And what I showed that in fact there was a lot of repression, there was a lot of inter-party conflicts, and the two leaders in particular that Lê Duẩn was able to sideline or marginalize was Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap, the two leaders who in the West we always identify with Vietnam's 30-year war.
Right, I hadn't realized that Giap had actually been in Hungary at the time of the Tet Offensive.
The Tet Offensive.
He was actually out of country during the attack.
Yes, he was apparently on medical leave, but in reality it was to show opposition to the war strategy at the time, which was what Lezuan was pushing for, this general offensive, general uprising strategy, as well as to sort of escape from what was going on, which was political repression and the arrests of his deputies at the time in 1967. And this leads to another myth. One of the myths, of course, was that North Vietnam never intended to win the war militarily, and that, in fact, something like the Tet Offensive was aimed at sort of striking a major political, psychological blow against the United States during a crucial election year. In fact, the General Offensive, General Uprising strategy had its roots in 1963, 1964, and Lezuan had tried to implement this strategy in 64, 68, as well as 72, each time to actually militarily affect the outcome of the war by toppling the Saigon regime. So, in fact, it was the strategy and the aim was to win the war militarily through this sort of
right. There seemed to be a and I want to get to this a little bit later too, because you probably know my work is on air power.
Yes.
And so I study how regimes, or how sort of how people interpret regime fragility. There seemed to be a sort of continuous misperception. Well, I don't know if you would agree with this, right? When I read it, I thought there is a strong series of misperceptions on the part of the Northern leadership with respect to the fragility of the Saigon regime, right? That they are always overstating the fragility of the Saigon regime.
Yes.
Although I guess that's not true by 75, right? You can even argue they're understating because they don't expect maybe that it's going to collapse as quickly as it does. But
yes, no, it's very true. I think Lezuan had wanted to win the war through this political military strategy known as the General Offensive, General Uprising, because he witnessed the mistakes made in the French Indochina War, a war in which the Vietnamese communist leadership was trying to follow more to a T the Chinese military strategy, or Mao's People's war strategy, in which they were trying to really fit this sort of three-stage process of warfare, and it just didn't work. They couldn't get from, the three phases are basically defensive, equilibrium, and then general counteroffensive, and they couldn't quite make the transition from equilibrium to general counteroffensive. And Lezuan thought that he stumbled upon the solution, which was this sort of combination of political struggle and armed conflict, so that they could bypass that pesky equilibrium stage and just get straight to the general counteroffensive, and it just didn't work because they weren't able to basically mobilize people against the Saigon regime.
Right.
And a lot of that was due to American air power. But
and one of the so some of the most interesting stuff so as you go through the plotting of the offensives and the arguments in Hanoi about how to carry it out, is how continuous and unhelpful the conflicting advice from Moscow and Beijing is, right? That they are hostile to one another. They believe that everything that Hanoi is doing is being sort of the machinations of the other communist superpower, and just colossal. Yeah, and I think the funnest part, and I tweeted this at the time, but the most interesting part was when Zhou Enlai blamed Lezuan for the assassination of Martin Luther King.
Yes, relations were very bad in 68.
That LBJ would not have okayed the killing of King if only Lezuan had not gone to come to the negotiating table, or something along those lines, right? But it was very strange.
Yeah, 68 was a very interesting year in Sino-Vietnamese relations because actually relations get worse in the early 70s. And 68 is sort of the period in which the Chinese really vent their frustration and anger out on the Vietnamese during their high-level meetings in Beijing. So they're still talking enough that they can sort of lay out why they think the North Vietnamese did so many sort of wrong things by agreeing to peace talks, and that they're totally going to be betrayed by the Soviet Union, that they've taken too much Soviet advice. But there still is a sort of they still are talking enough so that we can see sort of the state to which the relations had deteriorated up to 68. By the early 70s, they talk less because it's sort of unbridgeable, and that at that point they really are competing for mastery in Indochina. And that leads to the sort of second half of the myths that I think I challenge or debunk. And that is this notion of, the Sino-Soviet split didn't really have that much of an impact on the Vietnamese war effort because Hanoi was able to juggle both of its allies in Beijing and Moscow. And so they were able to extract maximum aid and maintain their independence from either Moscow or Beijing. And I show that, in fact, the Sino-Soviet split had a huge impact on Vietnamese path to revolution. And then later on, especially with Nixon's triangular offensive by the early 70s, that both allies exerted a lot of pressure on Hanoi to accept American aims at Paris. And so that ties into the debunking of, I guess this is now the seventh myth, which is that Nixon's diplomatic offensive didn't work.
Right.
And in fact, I show that it did. If you look at North Vietnamese writings at the time, that there was major Allied pressure for them to accept American terms, and that had an impact on their war strategy on the ground.
Right. Now, to get back to the review at Best Defense, now the reviewer there took you to task for not taking seriously enough the Sorley thesis.
Yes.
That the United States had effectively won the war by the end of the Tet Offensive, and then we just sort of gave it up. I read your book, and I have to say I'm completely unconvinced that. First I thought that it was sort of orthogonal, but at the same time, it seemed to me that you were sort of suggesting the center of gravity is in a completely different place than the Sorley thesis places it, which is in the countryside of South Vietnam. And I think what you're really arguing is that the center of gravity was in the North Vietnamese leadership, and that especially Le Duan, his perception of the war in the South never really changed.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, and I've that's tied, actually, and this is perfect because this wraps up all of my 8 myths, because the 8th one, I argue that it wasn't really about the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. In terms of, one of the myths of the conventional wisdom is that Hanoi, or the Vietnamese Communist war effort, won the political war for the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. And I say, actually, by the period of peace negotiations, they won the war on the global stage, in that it was for the hearts and minds of the world's people, if you want to put it in that sense. And so, in terms of had the United States won the war on the ground, that the South was pacified after the Tet Offensive? Well, yes and no. The Vietnamese Communist war effort was bloodied after the Tet Offensive, and that the insurgency was in a lot of trouble, but North Vietnam just needed time to rebuild. And it did. It received that time by sort of prolonging negotiations in Hanoi, to the extent that they could launch a general offensive, general uprising strategy again in 1972. Again, they weren't able to attain what they defined as victory, i.e. the toppling of the Saigon regime, but they just needed to bide their time for another 3 years, and that essentially happened by 1975. So it really wasn't about the sort of political or even military victories on the ground in South Vietnam, but it was about sort of buying time on the international arena. That North Vietnam that's where I argue that really, it could have, they won the war, and in fact, had Le Duan and his right hand man Le Duc Tho realize the sort of power that the North Vietnamese had in terms of what I just want to call diplomatic strength, that they would have actually utilized it in a better way to have, sort of saved more lives. Right. It was a very sort of wasteful and costly war, because Le Duan wouldn't abandon his general offensive, general uprising strategy.
Well, after that quick bathroom break and costume change, I think we're ready to continue. The book concentrates a lot on North Vietnamese decision-making. And because it concentrates on North Vietnamese decision-making, it's interesting, the work I do on air power, especially strategic air power. Part of the point of strategic air power is to affect the decision-making at the target. And so my question, and this comes up in the book, but maybe you can talk a little bit, how did the Rolling Thunder and Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2 air campaigns affect the attitudes of the North Vietnamese elite towards the war? How did they affect factional conflict in North Vietnam during the war? This was obviously the United States trying to influence stuff going on inside Hanoi, but did that work at all?
That's a very good question, and it's a complicated question. I would say on the whole that U.S. air power failed to really have a major impact on North Vietnamese strategy deliberation. In terms of rolling thunder, the problem there with the sort of graduated bombing campaign is that it wasn't strong enough to actually help the moderates who had been calling for leaders in Hanoi to end the war and to seek compromise so that North Vietnamese leaders could focus on socialist transformation of the economy, so sort of promoting the socialist revolution in North Vietnam over promoting war in the South. But my issue is that I don't think that the United States really could have done anything to help their position because they were in a weaker position pretty much throughout the war. And Lê Duan, who was the general secretary, who was in charge of was the head of the militant faction, was much stronger at every juncture. And more so, even as Rolling Thunder took a heavy hit on sort of North Vietnamese socialist development. Up to that point, it just didn't strengthen the hand of the moderates enough so that they would actually have an impact on decision making in Hanoi. In terms of Nixon's linebacker 1 and 2, I would actually agree that it had a little bit more of an impact on Lê Duan's decision making in 1972. In terms of, basically by that stage, following the Easter offensive, Lê Duan had wanted, when it failed in the summer of 1972, he wanted to ensure that North Vietnam wouldn't undergo any more heavy bombing and destruction by under the U.S. air war, and he was unable to escape that. So he did, at that point, decide to negotiate seriously, and linebacker 1 and 2 only underlined the need to negotiate seriously with an actual end to the conflict. But by then, Nixon, of course, had different aims in mind and wanted to use his trump card. So in certain ways, it was sort of it was too late. Lê Duan had already decided to negotiate seriously by that time.
Right. I mean, a pretty common critique from my understanding. I mean, linebacker 1 is, I think, the only one that almost everybody agrees was successful, right? Because it helped end the Easter offensive.
Yes.
It stopped it caused real conventional military pain to North Vietnam. The story that I understand about linebacker 2 is it was as much to convince Saigon of Nixon's seriousness as it was to convince Hanoi.
Yes, it was. There were many signs and signals that Nixon wanted to put forth with linebacker 2, and the President Nguyen Van Thieu in Saigon was definitely aimed at him in terms of Nixon no longer wanted him to hold out at Paris, and so it definitely was. Look, our support of you only goes so far. And it was also aimed at the Chinese and the Soviets, telling them to get their ally in Hanoi to the negotiating table. So It wasn't just directed at Hanoi. I agree that it, in terms of linebacker 1, did end North Vietnamese objectives to topple the Saigon regime. And it allowed the South Vietnamese army to retake Quang Tri City, which was sort of the symbolic city and province to retake on the part of ARVN.
Right. Now, and by this time, by the time we are, sort of after the Easter Offensive, and even in the run up to linebacker 2, I mean, this is the point at which Soviets have still been pressuring. I've been pressuring Hanoi for a long time to engage in serious negotiations, and the Chinese are now stepping up the pressure on Hanoi as well for negotiations. And this is after the rapprochement of in '72.
Yes.
Right. So I mean, I'm a political scientist, so I am inclined towards wild speculation. You're more of a historian, so you're less so. But when I was reading the the discussion of all the negotiations went down, and the various negotiating strategies from 68 to 72 and even into 73. One thing that sort of always came up to me was everything that's happening here with all of the different players, Hanoi and Beijing and Moscow and Washington and Saigon. What does this look like in a world where organizations like WikiLeaks exist, right? I mean, how important was secrecy for all of these players in terms of, being able to have different public positions from their private positions and from their negotiating positions? Now, and I know that, you described several occasions in which the Americans and North Vietnamese just basically sat at tables lecturing at one another from prepared points. But are there areas in which the ability to make secret negotiations really sort of made a difference in the pursuit of an agreement?
I think that's a really good question, and I would say that especially with how difficult movement was at the public talks at the International Conference Center at the Avenue Kléber, where all four sides were present. I mean, no movement, no progress could have been made, and that secrecy was paramount in terms of ensuring that the private talks, the private bilateral talks between Washington and Hanoi, could go forth in the manner that it did until Nixon announced the existence of the secret talks. Up to that point, it had been kept secret, and Kissinger, made great pains to prevent journalists from ever finding out about it, exactly where it took place, so on and so forth. And so that even though both sides, I argue in the book, didn't want to negotiate in good faith and come to a settlement before they had tried and exhausted all of their military moves, that nonetheless that the secret talks were very important to resolving the conflict, at least in 1973, to the extent that both sides are like, okay, we've tried it, we can't sort of on Hanoi's side topple the Saigon regime. That the secret talks as a form was very important at that point. With Les Juan, he really bickered with his foreign ministry. And as I said earlier, it wasn't until Guangzhou City was retaken by the ARVN that he finally admitted that he was, well, he never admitted that he was wrong, but he allowed the foreign ministry to go ahead and seek U.S. troop withdrawal over toppling the Saigon regime. Those twin aims, he believed, were inseparable. But by the summer of 1972, he said, okay, let's just try to negotiate the Americans out first.
Right. And when you talk about this a little bit, and I think that other people have, it's recently come up on a couple of occasions, but and it's not quite WikiLeaks, but there is sort of where Nixon and Kissinger, and I guess this is prior to the 68 election, during the negotiations of 68, make strategic revelations about the direction the negotiations are going in order to convince Saigon not to accede to any agreement.
Yes, there's in 68, the sort of element of surprise in Saigon. It was Thieu who delivered sort of the October surprise by withholding a delegation, sending a delegation to Paris and thereby undercutting Johnson's announcement made the day before. And so, I think in this day and age, I wonder the equivalent with WikiLeaks, in terms of how that actually, did that occur during the Vietnam War era? There were instances. One, the sort of Lam Sung 719 is an example in which U.S. military plans for Lam Sung 719 was leaked to the media, thereby endangering the opportunities of the RVNAF, the ARVN, to succeed with that operation. That there were instances with that. With the negotiations, I would say it was more of a, whenever anything was leaked, it was leaked by the Hanoi government or by Washington in a very conscious way.
Right. So, I guess you suggest you suggest in the book that the discussion over this period has in Vietnam now has loosened up some since. Obviously, Lê Duan has been dead for a long time, but parts of the conversation are still loosening up now. I mean, I guess what is the state of the domestic conversation over the war and over Lê Duan and Giap and everyone else? What are the trends in that conversation now in Vietnam? That's a really broad brush question, but
Yeah.
I mean, if you can sort anything interesting out of that, that would be that would be helpful.
Sure. You're right that with Lê Duan's death, there was an opening. He died in 1986. And at that point, Vietnam underwent what's called its renovation policies, Đổi mới, in which, a lot of people thought that Vietnam would go the way of the Soviet Union. It was Vietnam's version of perestroika and glasnost.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't happen. There were economic reforms and a move towards a market economy, but the social reforms political reforms didn't take place. But with his death, even though his successors, his acolytes, later came to power, so his sort of legacy could live on, there were cracks. And in 1988, in particular, there was at the 20th anniversary of the Tet Offensive, that was sort of the first. That was sort of the first admission that the Tet Offensive was a victory, but it was also a defeat, that many mistakes were made on part of the Hanoi decision-making body because the costs were so high. There were, of course, other, it's sort of the situation in terms of declassification of Vietnam War materials. It would sort of proceed in fits and starts. So there would be some sort of improvement and then a retraction. But I think, the major turning points would be also by the late 80s, the Vietnam decided to kind of go full force into integrating with the rest of the world, and withdrew its troops from Cambodia, decided to better relations with China as well as the United States. With the fall of the Soviet Union, that also marked another major change. I think in more recent years, it's what we saw more recently with the recent death of General Giap, that there has been a huge step in terms of improvement. That we're hearing more of sort of frank voices in terms of the Vietnamese war effort, because General Giap, and here's another sort of story that should accompany sort of the story of the Vietnam War, what happens to Vietnam in the Cold War and beyond, or even the post-Cold War world, was that Giap became marginalized completely after the Vietnam War, and he was forced to step down from any political office due to Lê Duan. And with his death and the international coverage that followed it, his story is being written back into the textbooks. Because it's very interesting. I mean, the younger generation born after the war didn't know that much of Giap's legacy. He's a hero to the rest of the world who supported the Vietnamese Communist war effort, but in country, right. He was really the full story wasn't as well known. And even though he became famous because he spoke out, right before his death against Chinese mining rights, bauxite mining rights in the Central Highlands, he became, sort of a celebrity with the younger generation who were very patriotic and didn't like to see, sort of Vietnam giving way to China. And it was really from that and sort of later in life what he stood for that people wanted to know more about sort of his role during the French Indochina War and the American War, the Vietnam War. But that had actually been really kept from the Vietnamese public. And so, it's only been, and I'm talking very recently in the past few months, that there have been even, sort of comments like something, for example, the Spratly and Parasol battles between the Republic of Vietnam, the Saigon regime, and the Chinese, that you have people in Vietnam saying that our Vinh troops fought bravely in that battle in 1974, which was unheard of, even just 5 years ago.
I find that interesting, sort of in context of And I mean, this was maybe going to be another part of my question, right? Sort of about, and I guess, or my guess would be that there's still not sort of any. In the United States, our memory of the Civil War is deeply divided along regional lines, right? And that was the case even right after the Civil War, right? The remembrance of the war. But my guess is that at least in public, there's no space for that in the South, or I mean, is there any space for that in the South, in the sort of the political life of the South today?
That's a little bit more complicated because the overseas community, some segments still try to undermine the Vietnamese Communist government. Some segments of the expatriate community, especially in the United States, are very active and sort of push forward. I'd like to bring attention to human rights abuses in Vietnam, and that is definitely a thorn in U.S. Vietnamese relations. So it's a little trickier in terms of giving space to the South. But that sort of, in many ways, there is a parallel with the American Civil War because there is this sort of lost cause argument on the side of those who fought on the part of the Republic of Vietnam. That said, there has been a sort of the Vietnamese government, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, has reached out to the overseas community because the overseas community represents, a major economic force in terms of helping to to build the Vietnamese economy. So in many ways, the Vietnamese government has tried to sort of welcome back the Vietnamese overseas population.
Right. I mean, and even and I'm going to butcher his name, but Nguyen He visited Vietnam again before his death, right?
Yes, Nguyen yes, the former vice president, yes.
Right.
He did, and his interaction with Vietnam towards the end of his death became a major source of debate amongst the Vietnamese overseas community, who really saw him as betraying. Since there are many Vietnamese expatriates who refuse to return to Vietnam so long as the communist government is still in existence.
Right. I mean, I remember I was teaching a class years and years ago, and we read his biography right before he went back and visited, or his autobiography right before his self-serving autobiography, but right before he went back and visited. It was a very interesting moment. Is there any chance that your book will appear in Vietnam, or has it, or?
There have been portions of it translated and have appeared on websites. And currently I do have in my possession a full Vietnamese translation, and when I'm working with UNC Press to get it published in Vietnam, and also to get it published in overseas, probably in the United States, in Vietnamese.
Cool. This has been a wonderful conversation. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Probably not. This has been great for me too, Rob. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And Foreign Entanglements viewers, as always, thank you for watching. And we hope to do more things like this in the future. So thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
All right. So.